Okay, thanks very much, Ray. I'm really happy to be here. You know, this is a topic which is near and dear to my heart because what we do at MRI is basically design online learning programs for market researchers. So this issue of what researchers need to know is absolutely central to our mission. The logical place, it seems to me, for us to start is to understand the current context. And the current context for market research is a much different sort of reality than what we may be accustomed to, say, a decade ago. And I think there are three parts to that. One is that clients expect more in return for less. And that has two dimensions to it, and I'll talk about those in just a second. The second is that we have the benefit, which can also be a challenge, of having more sources of insight available to us, both in terms of data and in terms of methodologies, than ever before in the history of this profession. And finally, and I think this is good news, there's a well-developed supply chain through which we can access those sources. So, you know, I'm probably the oldest person on this call, and I can remember a time when the conversation with clients was all about trade-offs, where we talked about time, cost, and quality. And the old joke was, of course, you know, choose any two. Well, those conversations were often productive, but that's not the world today. The world today is much more about fit for purpose, in which we all start with the assumption that whatever we're doing, it has to be fast, it has to be inexpensive, and what we're really trying to do is get to this issue of just how good enough does it have to be in order to meet whatever goal it is that our client has. But there's another element to this, which is that clients are also changing what it is they expect for us to deliver. What you see on the screen there is a set of archetypes that was developed by Adam Riley and David Smith with some work they did based on survey data of people who are on the buyer side, people who, what were they looking for in terms of researchers when they were awarding their work. And you can see of the six archetypes, in terms of how we think about traditional research, at best there's one in perhaps, or at best two, and maybe even one archetype in there that really fits with the way in which the vast majority of researchers not only have been trained, but the vast majority of researchers behave today. And sort of implied in all that is that what clients want us to do is climb this ladder of consumer insight developed by the Boston Consulting Group and move, for starters, from traditional MR to kind of business consulting, which is sort of where we've been in the sense that mostly what we do is we provide tactical advice. You know, do this to be able to sell more of that product. But increasingly, clients want us to talk about strategy, both in terms of insights into their current strategy, as well as help them understand where they need to take strategy going forward to be successful. Now, that is a heavy lift. A colleague of mine, MRI and a board member, Jeffrey Hunter, recently did a blog post which was based on a conference where he did a presentation where he talked about the importance of multiple data sources and the importance of delivering more consulting type, more information about implementation than maybe we're used to delivering. And the audience was super concerned about this. Just didn't see this as part of what their function should be. And this little quote sort of sums it up. It's one thing to be held responsible for the quality of the data and its fit for purpose. It's quite another thing to be held responsible for recommendations, which if implemented would have consequences. And this caused me to wonder whether or not this migration to a consulting kind of activity is really something in the DNA of who we think of today as insight professionals, practicing market researchers, whatever term you choose to use. Now, the second thing, which can be both a boon and a bane, is that there are more methods and sources for us than ever before. This little graphic on the side here on the right, this table, is taken from the GRIT survey. I think there are 21 different methodologies in there. Don't really pay attention to the percentages and all that stuff. The whole point of this is just to say, look at all these options we have for going about doing a piece of research. And so as researchers, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is it, should we know all of these? Should we be able to do all of these things? Historically, we sort of, in many ways, have behaved as a one-man or one-woman bands who can do all the steps in the research process, right? We know about sampling, we know about questionnaire design, we know about data collection, we know about coding, we know about data analysis, and we're, in some sense, experts across all phases of the research process. That gets harder and harder when you start talking about a whole bunch of different methodologies. Now, the good news is that there is hope on the way. I was at SMR in Nice at the Congress a couple of years back, talking to a friend of mine, Mike Cook from GSK. We were standing outside the exhibit area, which was huge, absolutely huge. And Mike said to me, he said, when I look in there, what I see is a supply chain. That it's no longer necessary for us to build or own all of the different kinds of services that we might need to do research. Anybody with a little bit of money can essentially go out and do almost anything that a company the size of GSK can do, simply by establishing the right set of partnerships with all of these various providers. And to make that go make that even easier, we're beginning to see MR trade shows emerge in place of conferences where sales is actually the goal, where people stand up on the stage and are given 15 or 20 minutes to sell. And that offends some of our sensitivities, but on the other hand, it is a way in which people can be exposed to different ways of doing things without having to go out and learn them on their own. Now, a number of years ago, Simon Chadwick put together this idea of the need for us to have inside of firms a set of roles, saying, we can no longer expect that a single individual will do everything. That succeeding in this new world means that we have to have a team. And he and I kind of played this out a little bit more in a paper we did for SMR a few years ago to try to put a little more detail behind it. But we saw, and this is really Simon's idea, so I want to make sure you understand that. But Simon saw three roles. The first of those is specialists. Right? So you're going to need people who can do all these new things. You're going to need access to data scientists, computer scientists, neuroscientists, statisticians, graphic artists, psychologists, all of these things. And if you work in a large firm, maybe you have those people in-house. If you work in a small firm, then that's where you're going to have to go up to the supply chain and establish the relationships with these kinds of people so that when you need them, you can bring them into play. On the delivery end, consultants are going to be very important. And these are not people, generally speaking, who are going to come up through the ranks of research. More likely, they're going to come out of business schools. And they're going to be much more savvy about business issues, about being able to understand the dynamics of industries than your typical market researcher. And in the center of all of this is a role that Simon calls the polymath, taken from the Greek, polymathos meaning someone who knows many things. And my own belief is that is the role that most people who today conceive of themselves as insight professionals are most likely to evolve into. Now, I had the pleasure of organizing a conference on this issue of what researchers need to know a couple of years back at Michigan State University. And one of the speakers we brought in was Kim Dedeker, who at one point in time ran all the international market research for Procter & Gamble. And rather than the polymath, she coined this term, the master generalist. And this really synced up in my mind with a piece I'd read by David Smith in Research World called Building the Skills of the Next Generation of Customer Insight Professionals. And when you go through David's article, you sort of come away with this notion that there are four things that this master generalist needs to be able to do. First, they need to make smart choices about which methods and data sources should be used given the particular business problem that they're trying to study. So the old days of all problems can be solved with some focus groups and surveys is long gone. And we need to look very carefully across the horizon and say, given what I'm studying here, given what's available in terms of data, given what different research methods can do for me, how do I put together the right package? How do I get the right group of specialists in order to be able to deliver the goods for this client? Secondly, there's a need to then, I love this phrase, assess the safety of the evidence. This is really about looking at a data set and coming to a judgment. Does it measure what it claims to measure? And here we fall back on two very common principles in my mind. One is principles of sampling. What principles of sampling teach us to do, aside from draw samples, is look at a data set, look who's in it, and determine the degree to which it matches the target population. The second thing we learn a lot about through questionnaire design, for example, is measurement. How do you measure certain constructs? So having those in your toolkit allows you to look at data and make those kinds of judgments to see just how good is all the various data sources that I'm looking at, and where the strengths and weaknesses, the biases of each one. And then, of course, the ability to synthesize those sources in a way that makes sense. All the data are imperfect, and how do we balance the imperfections in a way that allows us to move to the fourth skill, which is the ability to tease out and tell the story of the data in a way that's convincing. So, okay, final slide. This is something I stole from Nate Silver's book, the Signal and the Noise. He goes on based on some work by a guy named Philip Tetlock, and this is the quote I like: "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And what Tetlock did, he said there are two kinds of people when it comes to working with information. Foxes have a certain set of skills. They're multidisciplinary, they're adaptable, they're self-critical, they tolerate complexity well, they tend to be cautious and very empirical. Hedgehogs, on the other hand, do one thing really, really well. They tend to be specialized, rigid, stubborn, they seek out order, they're confident, they're ideological. We've all known people who fit into both of these buckets. And I think when we think about market researchers, what they need to know, how they need to behave, increasingly we need to be talking about foxes. And so people who are in the education business, like me, I think have to start, to begin with, emphasizing critical thinking, problem solving, rather than specific skills. Because the ability to exercise those specific skills, you're going to get that from the specialists we talked about earlier. The second thing is we really need to favor breadth over depth. We're no longer, if you're training hedgehogs, then you want to be all about depth. But if you're training foxes, you want to make sure you're exposing people to a lot of disciplines and teaching people to be flexible. Third, focus on principles that distinguish good research from bad research. This goes back to what I was just saying, talking about principles of sampling, for example, the ability to assess how well a piece of information measures an underlying construct that's important for me in what I'm doing in terms of my work for the client. And finally, we need to teach people how to connect specific methodologies to specific business problems. Given a client's business problem, what are the right tools that we can bring to bear? How do we use them to generate the kind of insight that's really going to help that client understand how to solve that particular problem or set of problems that he or she is dealing with? So, with that, I will say thank you very much for your time and for listening to me, and happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Reg. We've got one question coming in, but there will hopefully be time for a couple more. So if you're out there and you would like to put a question in, please use Twitter or the questions tool. And it's a two-part question, partly from Twitter, but actually partly from myself as well. So on the one hand, if we call ourselves master generalists, doesn't that sound a bit like jack of all trades? We're not really very good at anything. On the other hand, do we honestly believe anybody who is a polymath is going to choose to work for the salaries that we pay in the research industry?
Yes, I think so. I mean, because I think that first of all, why do people come to the research industry, right? They have curious minds. They enjoy working on the problems. But I also think that the investment that people have to make in their skills is very different. And just being here at TMRE this week, you see people going around and being exposed to things that they've never been exposed to before. I sat in a great session yesterday by one of my favorite presenters, a guy named Aaron Reed, has a company called Sentient Decisions, and And there were people in that room who were getting a presentation, which is really about, what is it we call it these days? It's not unobtrusive measures. What's the phrase I'm looking for?
Implicit.
Implicit, right. And so and he was given a presentation on implicit bias. And those people in that room really enjoyed it, asked a lot of questions, but they weren't there to learn how to do this work themselves. They were there to learn what's this technique about, and are there ways for me to use it? And it was interesting in this case because not only did he use a technique he has for measuring implicit bias, but then he moved to an ad testing phase of the research in which he used heat maps from eye tracking, looking at the ad, and facial recognition. So it was a lesson here about how you put, and he only has the one capability himself, which is this implicit measurement stuff he does on this neat little iPhone app. But, the point was that people could see the way in which you put three different methodologies together in a way that generates insights. And, these are people who think of themselves as just, garden variety market researchers. So, I don't think of the Master Generalist of the Polymath as a genius level person. I think it's just a person with an open mind who wants to learn about how he or she might use a whole bunch of different things in order to solve problems.
Okay, so the standard question for somebody talking to your topic, somebody is entering the industry as a graduate or as a postgrad, what would your advice be to them?
My advice to them would be to expose. I think the other piece of all this, right, is, and I always give this advice to people. What you should do is you need to go online and you need to immerse yourself in the MR social media bubble. Right? You need to be on Twitter. You need to be following hashtags like NewMR and MRX. You need to attend webinars like this one. You need to find every opportunity you can. Look at, follow the right bloggers. And you can really learn an enormous amount, again, what we might consider in the old school to be at a superficial level, but enough so that when you're looking at a problem, you have at least some ideas you can run through in your mind about, gosh, I saw this blog post by so-and-so the other day, maybe this is something we should explore. And over time, you begin to get enough knowledge about what an individual method can do for you that you can sort of think about it in the context of a problem. And I'm very reminded of the approach we take in the main course that we offer with Principles of Market Research. And that is when we get down to the toughest thing for many people, which is analysis. We say to people, we're not going to require that you memorize a bunch of formulas. We're not going to teach you, how to do this in R. What we're going to do is we're going to say, look, here are the options available to you in terms of analytic tools. Here is kind of the problems they're best suited to solve. And here's what you do with the results and how you apply that information. And I think we can take that concept and apply it much more broadly, not just in analytics, but also in methodology selection, investigation of data sources, recognizing that every study we do has to involve more than one method, and to give us this ability to triangulate based on these imperfect data sources that we can now bring together.